Watching online, welcome to you. The purpose of this place, which has now been going for 3 months, is to gather people together in person, IRL, in real life, and talk about stuff and work things out. We were very kind of unhappy during the long COVID era of everyone just stuck at home staring at screens and becoming completely crazy. So we thought we need to have a place to bring people together. That has now happened, but we also want to bring in our online audience, and they are here. We've had really sizable audiences tuning into these, so you are also very welcome. This concept of UnHerd Late, sometimes we do interviews, we're still kind of figuring out the perfect format. Sometimes we have visiting people or particular speakers. The idea of this is to have a bit more of a casual kind of evening. We're going to talk about a couple of different stories, so they aren't all scheduled in advance. And we've got some really great guests who I'm going to introduce to you in a minute. The format is we will have a bit of a kind of chat for 45 minutes on these different topics. Then there's going to be a break. Everyone can go and get a drink, or if you're at home, you can do whatever you like. That will be exactly 15 minutes, which will be militarily counted on this timer. And then at exactly that, we will start again, and we will end exactly half an hour after that. And then we can hang around. The restaurant will be open downstairs. We can do whatever we like. We do have a theme today, which is conspiracy. So this is already a word that has got us into trouble this week, because it turns out it is considered by many people as a sort of slur, that if you believe certain things that are anti-establishment, people tend to kind of brandish the word conspiracy at you, which is designed to shut you down and make you out to be a kind of, Fruit Loop. Well, we are not in the business of doing that. It's still a useful catch-all phrase for things that are widely considered by the establishment to be untrue, and there are undercurrents, different groups of people who believe they are true. So bear with us on that. We haven't got a better word for it yet. Maybe we'll work one out this evening. I think it really matters. We've done a whole bout of sort of polling and investigation into it this week. It's been Conspiracy Week at UnHerd, because I don't think people understand just how broad this issue now is. As we kind of emerged out of COVID, there is a whole chunk of the population that basically rejects as a default whatever they are told by the establishment. And that I really think is new. We did a poll, and we're going to show a couple of results of that. It won't be a big, boring presentation, but that is why we think it's worth investigating. It's not just about the UFO sightings and whether some of these stories have more exotic explanations. It kind of gets to quite a fundamental thing about where we are today. I'm going to introduce my co-presenter, Florence Read, who will also introduce our guests. Flo.
So one of the things that the universe has kind of dropped in our laps this week is that not only has our conspiracy polling happened to come out, but it has been a week dominated by stories that you might say had a kind of conspiratorial bent. To go through a couple of them, there were unidentified flying objects spotted across America, an airborne toxic event in Ohio, a story about the Nord Stream pipeline that I'm sure we'll get into, and a kind of rumbling satanic panic after the Grammys a few weeks ago. So if there's ever been a time to be conspiratorial, it was definitely this week. And today we're joined by two people who, in their professional lives, do butt up against what you might call conspiratorial in many ways, and we'll get more into that as we go on. The first to my left is Ralph Schoellhammer, who's a regular UnHerd contributor on the Post, a professor of international relations, all the way from Vienna. He's flown in especially for today, and he also writes for the Wall Street Journal, among any other publications, and he is a specialist in European politics, populism, culture, and the kind of baffling inner workings, particularly of the German parliament, which is something that feels like a grand conspiracy in itself because it's so complicated. So we'll get hopefully some insights from him there. And then to his left is Silkie Carlo, who is the brilliant director of Big Brother Watch, which is a think tank of great repute, which monitors human rights abuses across Britain and state surveillance, with a particular focus on how kind of Orwellian our day-to-day lives have become, hence the name. Silkie's also a regular guest on UnHerd TV, so do check out her videos with us. And that's our panel for today. We'll be covering a lot of these topics, but we'll also be hearing from you. We've got this fabulous polling technology, which we've kind of developed over the last few UnHerd Lates, and we're kind of still trying to work out how best to use it. But we want your help to find out kind of what people think. So if you can, scan the barcode. Don't worry, we're not kind of stealing your data. This isn't a grand conspiracy on our terms. Scan the barcode that's on your table or on the screen over here, and you'll be able to join in with the polls as we go through this evening. As I've said before, there is no need to sign up to anything. We won't ask for your name or details. It's totally anonymous. So nice and easy to avoid the conspirators there.
And if you're watching online, we'll post the link to it, so you don't need to scan the barcode.
Link will be there online, and also to our online viewers, welcome. And do leave your questions and comments in the chat, because we'll be spending the second half of this evening talking to all of you, as well as you in the room. So if you've downloaded that link, we can start with a little test, which will basically give us an idea of how everyone in this room and online compares to the country, because we've been going all around Britain trying to find out what people think about conspiracies. Our question that we've been asking people is, the world is controlled by a secretive elite, whether they disagree or agree with that. So we'd like to ask you that as well. So if you have a look at your polling app, you should be able to answer that question. We'll give you about a minute to answer, and we'll show it on screen as well. And what we have there is your results coming in. So you can actually see how the poll will change over time. Perhaps people change their minds as well when they see other people.
While that's coming in, I'm going to just compare it a bit to what we found in the rest of the country. So we did a poll of 10,000 people, which is an unusually large sample size for an opinion poll. And this was to try and do a kind of statistical analysis. We could work out which individual constituencies and parts of the country believe different things. And at the end of that survey, it turned out that 38% of the nation agrees with the statement that the world is controlled by a secretive elite. We're going to discover, as this process ends, whether we are more or less conspiratorial than the country. But the finding, I think, either way, was kind of interesting, because it's a big chunk of the population, more than the people who didn't know, more than the people who disagreed. And so when you get the politicians sort of dismissing these people, dismissing these theories, dismissing anyone who believes anything different, which you do hear a lot, they would do well to remember that there's a big chunk of the population that thinks that way. And it was particularly interesting once we started looking at the individual constituencies to note that of the most quote-unquote conspiratorial, and I confess, I'm first to say this, there are other ways of measuring conspiratorial than this is just a shorthand, all 10 were safe Labour seats. They were, interestingly, all in urban areas of sort of highly diverse, usually poorer areas that believed this the most. And when we got the least conspiratorial, or the people who'd completely rejected this statement, these were the beautiful rolling valleys outside London, the Chilterns, Surrey, Mole Valley, Amersham, places that had basically been safe Tory seats for a long time. Apparently, if you're sitting there, the elite doesn't feel so distant and malign and secretive. You basically feel like a part of it. So that is the discovery we made. Should we call an end to the poll?
Yeah, so we've got a 35% split, which lines us up pretty exactly with West Somerset. So as a room, you are the West Somerseters. And that also, I think, offers us quite a lot of room for manoeuvre. So by the end of the night, maybe we'll do that poll again and see how things have changed.
Let's kick off. We were going to talk about Flo, I got to say, is our resident conspiracist in UnHerd. Like, if there's things that I'm a bit unsure about, Flo is always on board with them. She's dragging me in the right direction here. So actually, maybe I think you should lead us on this one. The UFO sightings.
Yes.
They brought us back to the golden age of conspiracy.
They did. I'm quite a fan of the vintage conspiracy, and I actually think that there is a real kind of value in the benign conspiracy, of which, of course, aliens have always been one. They went out of fashion for a long time, post kind of David Icke in the early 2000s, but they seem to kind of be making a resurgence. But anyway, the reason they've been making a resurgence this week is because of these unidentified flying objects over America, 3 of which have now been shot down. Biden just did a press conference a few minutes ago where he still refused to say what exactly they were, though they are still being labelled as benign, which I think is an interesting word to use in this context. Silkie is someone who we've spoken to before about Chinese surveillance in particular, and the first one of these balloons was labelled a Chinese spy balloon. So I suppose the first question is, do you think it's plausible that China are sending these kind of retro balloons over America to spy on them? Is that possible?
Yes, I think it's absolutely possible. I mean, that's certainly the account that the public has been given so far. I see no reason to doubt it. I think the reasons that have been given for the kind of tactical advantages of having something that seems ostensibly ridiculous when we think about spycraft. It's the size of 3 buses or something. You know, normally we're thinking about something that could be hidden in a, you know, even in the 80s, you had spycraft technology that you could hide in a button or a pin. And now we live...
TikTok and those sort of things. Surely they get enough information off that. They don't need to send a massive, great balloon.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that there is this kind of... visually, it's quite abrasive with our idea of modern technology and modern surveillance. But there have been reasons given for why, you know, these objects were allegedly surveilling military sites and have distinct kinds of capabilities. You probably know lots about these kinds of things. I think it raises some questions more broadly about the state of international relations and surveillance, the kinds of panic that has been felt about what the US standing up to Chinese surveillance in this context means. But the oddity about that is that we live in an environment of surveillance, much of which is heavily Chinese manufactured. So, you know, I've spoken to you on UnHerd before about the sheer level of CCTV surveillance that we have in the UK. We actually have the same number of surveillance cameras per person in the UK as China has. And in the UK, a large number, in fact, probably the majority of publicly owned surveillance cameras are from Chinese state-owned companies. So we are funding the CCP to the tune of millions and millions of pounds for surveillance kit all the time. And yet now we're having a very public conversation about how anxious we should feel about...
Is this a bit of a red herring then? Because it's so visible and so kind of almost comically retro, does it actually take the attention away from the things that we should be looking at, which are these more obscure and, I suppose, maybe more sinister versions of surveillance?
First of all, I don't know how retro the balloons are. I think we need to find out more about what the technology was, and we'll have to wait and see what's disclosed about that. But
Can I just ask you an extra question, which is that, do you think they can log in to these pieces of kit? I mean, it's not just that you're paying Chinese state companies to manufacture them. Is there any risk that, were we to enter a wartime situation, they've got cameras covering all of our terrain and they could somehow just access them? Is that a risk?
Yes, I think it could be. It's not strictly proven, but there are some worrying indications. So there has been some research that has found, for example, unauthorized signals going from Chinese manufactured surveillance cameras in Europe going back to Chinese data servers. So that's very, very worrying, obviously. You would hope that our intelligence agencies are all over this. But then look what happens with the Huawei scandal. It took a long time and there was an internal row around costings, and it all feeds into international relations as well. My sense is, and interesting to talk about it when we're thinking about how planned and organised the world around us is, which we are talking about this evening, my sense is that our cards are just not in order on these issues. And when it comes to our relationship with China and our relationship with technology and surveillance, that there just is no forward thinking. Has anyone thought about what happens if we find ourselves in a hostile situation with China, and about what some of the distinct vulnerabilities in the surveillance technology might be? This is like Huawei 2.0. I think, the surveillance question. The companies like Hikvision and Dahua where if you look at, and you're going to start looking as paranoid as me now when you go out and about, look at the surveillance cameras around supermarkets, shops, etc., and look at what the branding is. And in your schools as well, hospitals, public buildings, a lot of them are hike vision. Many of them are hike vision. So you do have to play the thought experiment of what happens if we enter into a very different relationship with China. How much do we know about, the manufacturing all happens in China. And these companies are not only owned by the Chinese government partly, but subject to their laws, which requires them to comply with the national security laws of the Chinese government. So these things have to be thought about really, really seriously.
Let's bring in Ralph. You've come from Austria, but you're also familiar with the German-speaking zone.
Yes.
Is that fair?
That's fair.
I don't want to sort of lump you in together.
That's fair.
They're quite anxious about all this stuff in Germany and Austria, aren't they? Being surveilled. There's a lot more worry about your data and stuff. Are they more or less conspiratorial than we are here, do you think?
I don't think so. I think Britain, correct me if I'm mistaken, but I think, for example, the CCTV, that is something that particularly London kind of started very, very early on. So this is something we didn't have in Vienna or Berlin, but it's gradually happening as well. If you ask people what they prefer, like, cameras in subway stations or crime in subway stations, most people actually opt for the cameras. Right?
It's a false dichotomy. Yeah.
Well, but this is how it's presented to the people, right? This is, you had in Vienna with a couple of cases where somebody was beaten up in the subway and they said, well, what we could do is we could install a camera, and what was originally rejected by the people all of a sudden got significant approval. Again, I'm not saying that I find it is great, but it showed that the population seemed to be less wary about it. And the other point is, that nations spy on each other, and I think everybody in this room knows this. This is not something particularly new. Unfortunately, I think it was 10 years ago, I think, where China was hacking into the social security numbers of millions of Americans. Barack Obama was listening in on the phone calls of Angela Merkel. So even among friendly nations, unfortunately, this does seem to be more the rule than the exception.
So do you take the view, basically, then, that we should chill out about it a little bit? Like, there's always been spying. There's probably always been things flying around.
No, because
nations spy on each other.
Not at all. I think we should be, as the famous saying goes, eternally vigilant. But we should not be surprised, right? So I think what we hear a lot, not in the media so much, but also in the commentary, as Silkie correctly said, but I think there was this delusion that relations with China are going to be so great and economic integration will be this flowering, eternal, mutually beneficial relationship that we tend to willfully overlook, that for them, information is just a resource and they are very good in gathering it. I think you mentioned also before, TikTok is absolutely fascinating. Everybody knows that this is basically an open Chinese information gathering operation. We now also have, at least recent studies show that apparently it has horrible effects on young people, especially on young women, but we still don't do anything about it. So we can, as they say in New York, right? They can make laws that ban the size of or the amount of salt in your burger or the size of your soft drink. But if you basically give everybody a Chinese spy software into their hands, we say, there is not a lot we can do about it. So.
Do you think they could have been aliens, though?
I have a personal stake in this because I recently was writing an article where I was starting, because I'm a very uncreative writer, so most of my work is done by the editors at UnHerd. And I started with, it is more likely that UFO is going to land before that and that will happen. And of course, 24 hours later, the US Department of Defense said, well, it might be extraterrestrial. And I get emails every day that say, well, if you're wrong on UFOs, can we trust you on anything else?
Well, this has an international kind of relations bent to it as well, doesn't it? The idea that Biden is perhaps happier to intimate that there has been an alien invasion in America than to admit that there has been a corruption of American security through this kind of spyware, and that this might be far more widespread, as Silkie says, than any American might think. Surely that tells us something about the state of US-China relations.
Oh, God, it does, but it also tells us something about the general state of the US. If you listen to the reporting over the last couple of weeks, so after it turned out that the big balloon, and I don't mean to pop anybody's balloon, right? They caught it too late, and then they let it travel all over the US, and then finally they shot it down. And now a couple of days later, they said, well, we have now readjusted the radar, And we are catching much more things. Apparently, there's a lot of stuff going on up there. We simply didn't see it before because we didn't. I think they said they increased the sensitivity of the radar. So my question is, what did they do before that? It's like, oh man, there's all this stuff. It might be extraterrestrial. It might be Chinese. It might be Canadian. Seems very unlikely. But it's so again. My sense is, and this again needs us as citizens to be even more vigilant. I think very often the answer is, and I don't mean this to be a cheap joke, although I hope to get some laughs out of it, that incompetence is, I think, very often a better answer than conspiracy. Because you have not a situation, so first Biden hesitates. And now all of a sudden, because they criticized his hesitation, now he apparently shoots everything out of the other theories. They said, as you say, right, they said they don't know. It might have been a weather balloon. It might was a UFO. It might have been a drone. So apparently they're just shooting down everything that moves so that they can say, no, we got this under control. So
okay, we have to do an aliens poll.
We
now,
do. We
guys.
need to ask about aliens.
It's time.
Yeah, aliens are.
I think we've got 2 questions on this.
We've got
so
2
we need to hear what you
questions on
think.
aliens. So our first one is. Using Freddie's phrasing, on a balance of probability, very reasonable.
Let's be precise.
Is there extraterrestrial life beyond Earth? So I'm going to ask that one on our polling app. And if you would like to answer, please click now. Aliens are an interesting one because they do seem to span highly reasonable scientific people and also total crackpots who kind of share this common belief in something beyond our Earth. So that poll should be up now. You can answer as you wish, and then we'll hopefully be able to see.
Since you're not actually answering the poll, what would you answer, Silkie? On the balance of probability, extraterrestrial life?
I think statistically there's a strong argument for it, isn't there? I think, the universe would be very disappointing if we're it.
Ralph?
No offence, but...
E.T.?
I hope so. I really do. I think this would be such an interesting thing. I hope that there is extraterrestrial life.
That's what we like to hear. Okay, so we have... Flo, do you have the actual result there?
We've got some very enthusiastic ET watchers here. 84%, almost 85% think that on the balance of probability that there is extraterrestrial life. Oh, we've got a few naysayers coming in the late innings. So we're down to 75%. A few of you must have changed heart. There's another question here, though, which, of course, is the big question of this week, which maybe takes us a little bit further down the rabbit hole of conspiracy, which is, has extraterrestrial life ever visited Earth? So I'm now going to open that poll, and I'd like to hear whether you think extraterrestrials have actually come down here to see us. Do you think that might have happened?
Come on, Ralph.
Well, as I just recently wrote, it's completely unlikely, but now I'm changing my opinion. I mean, depending where they landed, apparently it was not as appealing to them as one would hope, or not. Or
what, when they got a fighter jet coming after them?
Yeah.
Do you think it's the ultimate Big Brother to watch? It's the aliens.
I don't. I think Beyonce is out of this world.
Okay, all right.
Okay, so we've got on that less enthusiastic from the audience. So it seems to me that the vast majority of people seem to think there's something out there. They just haven't bothered to visit, which is an interesting conundrum.
Okay, we're going to move to our second topic now, and this one is a really, I think, serious one because this concerns the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I don't know if you're up on this, but these are big gas pipelines that transport natural gas from Russia to Europe. There was Nord Stream 1 that went live, I think, in the 90s, and then Nord Stream 2 is the second big pipeline that was detonated, blown up, sabotaged, destroyed completely in September of last year in what must have been a very complex operation. It's very deep under the sea, it's very hard to do, and somebody did it. So it's definitely not a conspiracy to say that somebody blew up Nord Stream 2, because they did. What people can't agree on is who. And people seem bizarrely uninterested in this, I find, in the establishment media at least. There's a sort of silence about it, but if you think about it, the two obvious candidates are Russia and the US. I've heard more imaginative solutions being suggested. Both options I find very concerning because it's a majority Russian-owned pipeline, 51% owned by Gazprom. if they have chosen to blow up their own pipeline, what they could then be capable of afterwards, I dread to think. It shows a sort of, either it shows a sort of disorganization at the heart of the regime that should make us all very worried, or it shows a kind of nihilism and a recklessness that, given what other weapons they have, we should be really, really worried about. If it's the Americans, I'm as worried about it. That's the kind of sophisticated thing. Of course it's the Americans, they're always up to this kind of thing. But given that the CIA responds only to direct orders from President Biden, you've got to, if you're going to sign up to the American thesis, you've got to believe in a world in which the current sitting US president in 2023 goes into the Situation Room and says, yes, destroy Germany's infrastructure, my NATO ally, my partner in this current war, destroy it, and then don't tell anyone about it and deny it. You know, that is, perhaps that is the world as it really is, but it feels to me like it's quite an important thing to know either way. If that is the truth, then American power is more brutal and more brazen than many people realized it was. I did an interview with someone called Jeffrey Sachs, who is by no means an establishment figure. He is kind of banned from the establishment for various misdeeds. He is a true believer in the American theory, and we've got a clip now that I can play. This was earlier this week on Monday. Even though there is all this circumstantial evidence, and even though a reputable journalist has now come out saying they have a source, although that single source is unnamed, it still perhaps stretches the imagination for some people that the US would actually order the destruction of a piece of public infrastructure that is in part owned by its NATO ally and current ally in their current military operation, Germany.
Well, then they don't really know the US. If you follow the US for the last 5 decades, actually 6 decades from Vietnam onward, you know a lot about this, this is what happens when you have a secret intelligence unit, the CIA, which carries out covert operations. That's their job. Presidents give orders. They do all sorts of things. They make coups. They create civil unrest. They create, quote, revolutions. They blow up infrastructure. It's part of the job. And it's actually quite well known.
Jeffrey Sachs, ladies and gentlemen. I've got to come to Ralph here. This is a German pipeline. What is your view on it? You're an expert on these things. What is the view in Germany on this question, and who do you think did it?
Well, the view in Germany is that, and in Austria the same, the view that the Americans did it is very, very popular. But that's exactly the point. It's popular, right? It's not based on an assessment. It's not based on any facts. It's popular because anti-Americanism has still a lot of purchase in Germany that has been unchanged. And I think there is that more psychological thing, and I think this also applies, with all due respect, of course, to Professor Sachs, but also a little bit to him. If the worst guys in the world are the Americans, well, then the world can't be that bad. Right? And you see this in this whole debate. The Russians, the Chinese, they're all just extras in this great game that is played by the CIA and all these others. I don't think that's the case. Nations are not necessarily good or bad. They follow their interests. And if I look at the Nord Stream 2 case, we have to see what kind of type Joe Biden is. And just as a reminder also for the audience, Joe Biden told Barack Obama that he does not want to do the raid on Osama bin Laden. Right? Joe Biden was hesitant to shoot down a Chinese balloon over US territory. They waited until it crossed the entirety of the United States. Joe Biden was responsible with the CIA, that supposedly is all-knowing and all-capable, of the disastrous retreat from Afghanistan, which was kind of the worst military failure of the US in 50 years at least. The US haven't won a war since 1945, which I think is also a reason because of their supposedly great secret services. So the idea that Joe Biden hesitated in every foreign policy, covert action, or military action. But then he's the butch guy who goes to the Norwegians, the Swedes, and the Danish, whom we all know are like the worst belligerent people in the entire world. He goes to them and says, let's blow up a German pipeline, which is, in fact, its energy infrastructure. This is tantamount to a declaration of war. And the Swedes, the Danish, and the Norwegians say we do it, and no word gets out. Like no journalist in Denmark, nobody of the Danish establishment says, you guys know, war with Germany is probably not really something we have an interest in. So the pattern doesn't fit. Another president, maybe. But with Joe Biden, and this is what Sachs and what the Seymour Hersh article says, right? They explicitly say this all came top down. This was Biden all the way. And as I said, it doesn't fit the pattern for me. Right? If somebody has been hesitant his entire political career, and Joe Biden's career is, well, I think he did not join
long.
this. It's long, right? He's slightly shorter than Queen Elizabeth II's reign. So if somebody had one pattern his entire life, that he switched it in this one very moment, that just happens to fit narrative for so many people, I'm doubtful. Again, I can be proven wrong because I'll be very honest, I don't know who did it. But what I've seen as supposed evidence that it was done by the Americans is for me not sufficient.
I mean, just to take the Jeffrey Sachs line here, I was pummeled on the YouTube before taking the opposite line earlier in the week, so I happily take this one. It's just true to form for the Americans, isn't it? Yeah, you say it's not the all-seeing, all-knowing mastermind. No, it's kind of cat-handed, possibly unnecessary because the pipeline wasn't being used anyway. But then if you look at their performance over these decades, they have form in this. They have a very kind of muscular military establishment that basically the president signs off their decisions. They said this is a good idea. Possibly the Germans were involved in it and allowed it as well. And they just did yet another thing. And by the way, it's now been outed. If you believe some of these investigative journalists, the secret's already out. So they didn't even do a very good job of covering it up. Isn't that the argument?
If that comes out, then as I said, I'm very open to the evidence if it should come up in that form. But at the moment, again, for me, this sounds just like we so desperately wanted to be the Americans, so we kind of add up every piece of potential evidence that it's the Americans. There's this famous interview with Biden where he says, we're going to stop Nord Stream 2. I said, he said it. Okay, but then it's no longer a covert operation, right? This is, and politicians say lots of stuff. This is for me not enough as evidence. And as a last point, just real quick, there is a difference if you plan an invasion of Iraq. There is a difference if you participate in a bombing campaign in the Balkans, than destroying critical infrastructure of a partner, a common NATO member state, and potentially risking a direct military confrontation with a nuclear power. I think that the stakes are so much higher for, as you mentioned in the conversation, for a pipeline that wasn't even operational.
So who did it then, Ralph? If it wasn't the Americans, who was it?
Well, I have an answer for this. For the Russians, it made absolute sense. Who profits from reducing potential gas flights to Germany? Whose leverage is increased by that? It's Russia's leverage. It's great for Gazprom because they basically can cut off deliveries that they are contractually mandated to do. They can claim force majeure. They can say, we would like to deliver, but those pipelines were destroyed. The Russians have gone very quiet, very fast.
They weren't using the pipeline anyway. They didn't need to blow it up. The Germans had failed to license it. It wasn't being used, the Nord Stream 2.
But it could have been. Right? This was a cutoff point.
Multi-billion-dollar pipeline just for good measure.
The other thing that gets me, and maybe this is just because I'm so conspiratorial.
I think the billions the Russians have currently, burned in Ukraine, I think the pipeline is the least of their concerns.
But why the lack of investigation? This is what irks me, is there's such a shroud of silence around this question. Surely if Russia had been caught in this massive act of international sabotage, the impetus would be on Sweden, Denmark, Germany, the whole of Europe and America to find this out and to bring it to a world stage.
That is exactly my point. That is exactly the point. If all the parties supposedly involved, the Danes, the Swedes, the Norwegians, maybe even the Germans themselves and the Americans, right? Every journalist, this would be the story of a lifetime. So I would assume that there, as you just said, I assume there would be interest in that story. Somebody in Copenhagen, somebody in Stockholm, somebody in Oslo, somebody would say something at some point. But apparently, everybody in Norway, everybody in Sweden, everybody in Denmark, they must be maybe the Scandinavians are really good at this, they must be the greatest secret keepers of all times. So we have one source in that article, one person, nobody knows who that person is, nobody knows what their position is. It's some guy who says, we did it, but we don't know, maybe it was me, right? Seriously.
Was it?
Well,
that coffee you had with Seymour Hersh last week.
I was knee deep in the UFO stuff. But again, I said, if new evidence comes out, I'm the first one to say, all right, I was wrong, it was the Americans. But currently, I don't think that the evidence bears this out.
I think we need to find out what everyone else thinks now. Flo, do we
If
have
you open your polling apps, you will see the question, who was responsible for the Nord Stream 2 pipeline attack? We have got some very firm answers here, definitely Russia, definitely America, and then some less firm, not sure, or someone else. People seem quite split, actually, as you see those coming in.
I found this a really interesting one. In fact, I think about it all the time, who did this, because it sort of decides what your worldview is, which way this one goes, I think. And there are people I know, some of them even in this room, dare I say it, who will probably take completely opposing views on this, even though they are highly educated, highly sophisticated people, and each one might think that the opposing view is completely mad. You know, so if you think the Americans would do this, you're an absolute fantasist conspiracy guy. Or if you think the Russians did this, you're just sort of ignoring what is so plainly obvious. You're naive. You might as well just be part of the conspiracy yourself. The cleavage, the gap now between what educated people think about the world I think has never been broader.
Our room seems to be leaning towards the fantasists, which is exciting for me, of course.
Well, not the fantasists, the realists.
The realists, who are very much pro the idea that America was indeed responsible. And so perhaps they were enjoyers of our
Nobody
Jeffrey Sachs
says someone else. So I've heard. I've had some wacky theories. I won't share them today. So one chart that was sort of surfaced during our investigation of conspiracy this week was a COVID-related chart. And I don't think you can go a whole 45 minutes discussing conspiracy without mentioning COVID. I think we can put it on the screen. And what it shows is the amount that people searched for conspiracy theory. This is over the past 7 years. And guess what that huge peak is? It is March 2020. It is when the world was shutting down, one country after one other country. This is evidence, I think. But even the strongest skeptic must pay attention to it. And I think there can be no doubt that that long now period of months and years of people in what seemed like such an alienating, weird time where life was shut down, you didn't fully understand it, and the media and the government and the opposition, everyone was just nodding their heads and agreeing that this is absolutely, definitely the right policy, and anyone who said anything in opposition to it was a kook or irresponsible. If anything is going to turn people into conspiracists, it was that. And I think the reason we now have 38% of the population feeling so distrustful of the elites is in no small measure due to the weird COVID years that we have just emerged from. Happily, we have with us Silkie Carlo, who has published a report most recently. She has a copy of it with it called Ministry of Truth, the secretive government units spying on your speech. She has investigated what actually happened during the COVID era, and what might have seemed at sometimes like a conspiracy, you have found is actually real. What did you find?
Well, we found that a number of secretive government units during the pandemic, some were actually set up beforehand, but they were particularly active during the pandemic, were monitoring dissent against COVID policies under the banner of combating disinformation. So actually the terminology of conspiracy theory feeds in a lot here, because these units, like the Counter-Disinformation Unit, which sits in the Culture Department, another one called the Rapid Response Unit, which sat in the Cabinet Office, claim to counter things like conspiracy theories. And it's really compelling language. And so we've done a long-term investigation to find out what were they actually doing, what resources did they have, who was affected. And what we found is that, what we know is that they were certainly monitoring high-profile critics of government policy on COVID, far away from the territory of conspiracy theory. So we're talking David Davis, MP, Professor Carl Hennigan, lots of UnHerd contributors, myself, other people who had an audience during the pandemic and who were criticising government policies, sometimes even just questioning them, MPs, journalists,
So who was it? Who was
campaigners.
sitting on the other end? It's like The Lives of Others, that movie. Who was on the other end of the listening device?
So, these are people, civil servants working in government, who, some of whom claim to be, so there's a crossover between disinformation specialists and media, kind of government media operations. But there's a very good question. Who is qualified to do this? Who is qualified to be the arbiter of truth? Who is qualified to determine what is disinformation? What was the truth in such a fast-moving situation? Did we know what exactly the right policy was, or what the science that we had to follow was during this period of time when we were still discovering things? So I think that there's an operational issue with the fact that millions of pounds of taxpayers' money was going into something which really has the potential to subvert democracy. I mean, you're spying on your own MPs, your own academics, human rights campaigners, and compiling records on them. Not just for fun, by the way. These units have special relationships with the big tech companies, and they are called trusted flaggers, which means that if they flag that information is inappropriate, or they ask Twitter or YouTube, should this be on the internet, it gets looked at pretty fast. And a lot of the people who were in these records...
So they had special channels to YouTube, Twitter.
Yeah.
We learned that during the Twitter files, I guess. They would,
yes, exactly.
This is kind of people like shut down.
Yeah, this is kind of like UK Twitter files. And we're asking Elon Musk. I've written to him and asked him to publish all of the correspondence that came from the UK government. Let's start the investigations. Let's have all of the correspondence out. Let's find out what really went on. I think when a government tries to control the information that we can see and read and hear, especially at a time when people's lives are at risk and when our livelihoods, liberty, economy, everything was at stake, to narrowly limit what people can say and read and share to the confines of what the government want you to say and read and share is really the apex of totalitarianism. I mean, it's just so absurd. And my worry is that, what we've uncovered, we focused on COVID because we knew that this was so well funded during COVID, but the capability is now permanent and the resource is now permanent. So we now have counter-disinformation operation that runs through the UK government that is doing stuff that we don't know about. I mean, talking about secretive elites, this is totally secretive. We've
got to play a clip of Silkie's interview with an anonymous soldier who his voice has gone through a distortion mechanism, which does make it sound extra sinister, but he belongs to something called the 77th Brigade, which is a division of the army. So he signed up to be a soldier, and this is how he spent his time instead.
So there would be two different ways of doing it. So one thing you would do is, and initially there was no guidance, so it was just find foreign misinformation online. And so we just had to generate our own search terms, and we would just be searching COVID-19, death rate, or whatever. You just type in the search terms, see what came up, and anything that was essentially reflecting poorly on the government, or anything that was negative really to Boris Johnson, the administration, or anyone like that.
I mean, I loved what you did to the voice as well. You
could have shown the video. It was a bit like, where is he?
Yeah, well, they get upset at YouTube, actually. If you show videos from other YouTube videos, they don't shut you down. Do you think, let me put the counter view just before we go to the break, just because I have to do that. Do you think we are over-dramatising it here? Do you think with voice distorters, is there a view that says, look, of course there are sort of cyber warfare and intelligence people within an army, that's what we'd expect. We face these kind of threats, and during a big crisis like COVID, a case that they were monitoring things that they felt were bad for the public health. Anyone can be with me on this side of the argument? Ralph, what do you think?
Well, I already gave away my appreciation of UFOs now. I mean, I think this is bad, and I think it happened in other countries as well. I think that it's really grateful for the work that you do to uncover these things. But to some extent, I'm afraid that also all of us have to take a look into the mirror, because there is a tendency, and I think the tendency is true in Britain, the tendency is true in continental Europe as well, this idea that whenever a crisis comes, the only institution that can rescue us is the state. So we push more and more power to the state, and the state then builds these vast bureaucracies that start to develop a life of their own, that then indeed become true conspiracies, because these bureaucracies, they see themselves as eternal, which is also in their nature. So they want to continue their existence. So they take on everything that they think kind of serves the purpose of prolonging their existence, very often, I think, without talking to those who are supposedly in charge, right? Whether it's parliamentarians or whether it's the government. But this is and we have this for a long time now in Europe, this idea that, again, every crisis must be solved by the government. Every crisis, only the state can solve it. So we push more and more and more power towards the state. And at some point, the temptation for some, either it's individuals or divisions, to abuse that power is growing. And then they have all their tools at their disposal. We have a problem with encroachment of bureaucracy in too many areas of life. In general, right? Even in areas where we like it. And I think this is something that at some point we have to face. There's too much of a too powerful state. And I think Silkie is absolutely right. At some point you end up in a totalitarian system without planning it.
But who wanted the arms of the state to be controlling the information that we receive or spying on our MPs? I mean, I don't think there was any public impetus for that. You speak about cyber warfare, and don't we, isn't this what we expect, the army to spy on the population? No. You have cyber warfare between nation states and hostile nations. When the threat is your own population, then we've got a really big problem for democracy and for liberty. That's what I think part of what we've uncovered is, that these secretive, they are completely secretive. I mean, it was like getting blood out of stone doing this investigation. I can talk more about that. But when you have, and by the way, publicly, the 77th Brigade said that we never conduct operations in relation to the British population. Now we have on record the Defence Secretary saying that they were conducting a UK operation. So we've got a 360 U-turn in terms of what was declared that was happening. When we see that military power is being deployed against our own population in the information sphere, on stuff that was non-threatening, threatening to nothing but politicians' reputations, then this is a scandal. We need answers. We need accountability. Something's got to give.
You can applaud if you like. So, do we have a final poll before we go to the break?
Yeah, so our very final poll today is one about how you identify, not gender-related. It is going to be about whether you identify as a conspiracy theorist, because we said at the beginning of the show that it's sometimes seen as a kind of slur, but there's other people who hold it as a badge of honour. So my final question is, how do you identify a conspiracist and proud, a closet conspiracist, or a regular old normie? Don't worry, we love you too. We should have done a write-in option. It looks like our normies are winning out.
Conspiracies are coming up now.
Coming up. Yeah. Okay, so there we've got a 41% normie contingent. So maybe we still have a little bit more time to convince you in the second half.
We're going to take a 50-minute break. If you're watching online, come up with your questions and comments. We're going to involve them afterwards. Otherwise, we're going to open it out. So think of those great thoughts and share us in exactly 50 minutes. See you then. Welcome back, everybody. This is UnHerd Late, episode 2. We have with us here in our little club-like environment in the middle of Westminster. I always say in Westminster, but not of Westminster. We are close to the structures of power, but we do not let them influence us. We have a beautiful group of people, and we're hoping to open out this conversation beyond just the four of us, where we have been talking about conspiracy and various instances of what may or may not be examples of it. And let's see what some other people think. Also online, if you are watching, we will bring in some of your comments. Flo has a microphone, so if anyone wants to just join in, now is the chance.
Right, we take a show of hands. Oh, great. We'll just get her at the front. There you go.
Hello. Just listening to this, I thought it might be useful, and also when the poll happened just now, to get some kind of working, useful definition of what conspiracy actually means. Because it seems to be a movable feast. If you're Fauci in 2000, your definition of conspiracy is anyone who is suggesting a lab leak, for example, only to find out later that it's a perfectly plausible, robust working hypothesis. So if we use that scientific method idea, for example, one way of doing it might be, what is the difference between a hypothesis and a theory? A hypothesis is something that you put on the table scientifically, and if it starts to mount compelling evidence towards it, it starts to become robust. If it gets more and more evidence over a significant amount of time, it starts to become a theory. So the theory of evolution is a theory with a lot of evidence, and it's been rolling for many decades, so we call it a theory. So surely conspiracy has to have some kind of hypothetical value to be a reasonable assertion, but it seems this movable feast. So what would be a reasonable definition of the word conspiracy? I think it'd be useful to have that.
I think that's a good point.
Anyone want to offer one?
I mean, you did the polling,
Yeah?
so what did you mean?
Well, we called it conspiracy, and maybe we shouldn't have used that word because it is such a tricky one. The reality is that phrase that we chose to measure, which is the world is controlled by a secretive elite, was one that way back in 2015 when I was working at YouGov, we tested. And this was when there was the Labour leadership election in 2015. And it turned out that Jeremy Corbyn fans were overwhelmingly in line with this idea that the world was controlled by a secretive elite, much more than all the other Labour or Tory fans. So I just thought it'd be interesting to see how it had changed. And yeah, it was an imperfect way of measuring it. I mean, my kind of sense on conspiracy is I completely agree. So many things. I mean, the people who like to walk around pointing the finger and calling people conspiracy theorists are not my people. I feel strongly opposed to them. And indeed, as you said, the last few years have been a terrible period for so-called conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. And you mentioned the lab leak theory. I'm not sure that's 100% proven to be true, but it's definitely considered a plausible option for the origins of COVID-19. We may find in coming months and years that Nord Stream 2 turns out to have been an American covert operation, in which case that will be another conspiracy theory that turned out to be true. For me, the interesting and I think most salient distinction is, given all of the crazy stuff that happens in the world and all of the screw-ups and all of the hysteria and kind of mass groupthink, is it ultimately controlled by a small, powerful group that are somewhere to be found in a room or in Davos or in one of these places? Or is it not? For me, that is the distinction with whether you're a real conspiracy theorist or not. Because on that measure, I guess I'm less of a conspiracy theorist, because I tend to agree with you that I think it was actually Ralph who was saying that incompetence is a better explanation than conspiracy usually, and that people are generally less skilled, less all-powerful than you might think. So that's one potential definition. You know, do many of the weird things that happen in the world that appear to be nonsensical, are they best explained by a small, all-powerful group who is orchestrating them? That would be the conspiracy answer. Or is it just a symptom of our general tendency towards hysteria and bad decisions.
Something that's been mentioned a lot in our YouTube comments over the course of this evening is what happens when a conspiracy goes from being a conspiracy theory to a conspiracy that people acknowledge is a conspiracy. So the lab leak might be one example of that. Do we owe an apology to the people who were called conspiracy theorists when that was still a theory after it becomes obvious that that is actually a reality? We've had Jay Bhattacharya, the epidemiologist, on UnHerd many times, who was basically nailed as a fringe epidemiologist, one point was the word used, and actually even more so as a conspiracy theorist at others. What do we owe to those people at the point at which we move on as a society and decide actually that's now going into the box of fact rather than fiction? Is a kind of big question I think a lot of our followers are really interested in. It's quite a, I suppose, philosophical question.
I think probably rarely we should be calling people conspiracy theorists. I mean, there's a time and a place for the term, but we have to be clear about what it means and what we're trying to achieve by using the terminology, because it is used to stigmatise. And as you said, now even some of the world's leading scientists, it has been used to stigmatise during this extraordinary political period. As someone who works in a sector that aims to hold power to account on behalf of people, the starting point is to have a healthy dose of suspicion towards people in power. I don't think we should be too nervous about that. I would be nervous about the opposite. You know, you have to have a healthy dose of suspicion towards people in power. And people who accumulate power and who accumulate wealth will sometimes work together towards their common interests. This is starting to get towards what some people might call conspiracy, but really it's just how power operates. And so I think there's nothing really wrong with that. So if you're looking at situations and thinking about how powerful interests might converge or be involved in a certain situation or a certain outcome, then it's not, this is sort of what you do when you're holding governments to account. And, you know, we have seen increasingly that people who have held governments to account have been called anything from agents of disinformation to conspiracy theorists. So we also have to be cautious about the terminology and clear about what it means.
Hear, hear.
Another one from the room, perhaps. That's a lovely tall hand.
Thanks very much. I think one of the things that I think about in wider society is it's very convenient and it's quite lazy, I suppose, which is unfortunately a human condition, I guess, to just go with what's said by the power or by the consensus. Because actually to stand up and say, no, I don't think that's right, or even I don't know the answer, but I would like more knowledge on that, or someone should be questioned, or someone should be held to account on it. So it's a very, very convenient or sort of a lazy narrative, and there's also a safety within it, isn't there? Or someone else made the decision, so even if they turn out to be wrong, I sort of I had to trust them. They were the expert, or they were the elected minister, or the prime minister, or the leader. It's not my responsibility. Because for me personally, I took some risk in it, into the COVID thing and some other bits, to say, let's just think about this. I haven't got the right answers. Someone would say, oh, you're not a scientist, you're not a medic. And I just said, well, it doesn't seem to add up to me. And I spent some time to think about it, and I think that's the right thing to do in a sort of a live society. It's a very, very good thing, isn't it, to people to question. And maybe some things I was wrong. But actually, I said, let's think about this, and this doesn't add up. This doesn't make sense. So let's try and move away from that sort of, convenience, I suppose, but just think perhaps it's part of our human nature, I suppose. So, the conspiracy thing, I think, is being used to silence people, to allow that kind of like, oh, well, we'll just sort of sit back and not take any responsibility. And that's very, very dangerous, because power will corrupt and do what they want to do.
I mean, when, Ralph, Germany, which you know a lot about, has had a blossoming of more conspiratorial political parties recently, hasn't it? COVID was radicalized a lot of people in Germany as well, and there are, I think I'm right in saying, some quite out there concepts in some of the political parties, and I just wonder what's your view on this? When does it go too far? When does healthy skepticism, distrust of power, refusal to be told what to do, when does it bleed into something that is a bit more kind of dangerous.
Well, I think the gentleman asked the perfect question, right? How do we define a conspiracy? For example, I think the lab leak is a very interesting example, because if the argument was, I think, which was the correct word, that it could have been possible, or maybe even at this point very likely, that the virus escaped because there was an accident in a laboratory, I think that is very plausible, right? I think that is not a conspiracy. That seems to me like something that could really have happened. But you cross over into conspiracy, as I had a personal friend, still a friend, by the way, so I never ended friendships over, who said, well, but there was this book written in 1995 that predicted that out of Wuhan this virus is going to come. So the author knew, 25 years ago what is going to happen. Then you're actually in the realm of the conspiracy theory, right? Because then it's no longer a competing theory or a competing hypothesis. For a German, a very hard word to say, but then it's kind of then you cross over into potentially, and I say it very carefully, quote unquote, nutty territory. But what you were right? I think the thing is now, but of course, it's very nice to mix those two things up, right? I think this is what happened with the Great Barrington Declaration with Jay Bhattacharya, right? So they say lockdowns might not be the right way, and then you take this one thing, which I think they were correct, you mix it with something that is conspiratorial, like, there was a book written 20 years ago that Nostradamus said this is going to happen, and then the whole thing is becoming a conspiracy, right? It's like I try to excuse my French, but one Canadian author once said it in a different setting. It's like, if you have a pint of ice cream and I add, dog feces to it just a little bit and I mix it through, you don't say, oh, it's 99% vanilla and it's just 1% dog feces, so it's basically still good. This is not how you react to it, right? And I think this is, of course, how in the as you mentioned, the public discourse, I think conspiracy is used. So somebody says something that is plausible, but somebody who doesn't want that plausible theory, maybe for political reasons, maybe for economic reasons, not to get out, they take this plausible theory and then they add this little bit to it, and then it becomes problematic. So we have the theory, which I think is a plausible one. This might have escaped from a lab, human error, very bad hygiene conditions, things. We know that these things can happen, and this would not fit a narrative. So we say, this must be a conspiracy because you say this is what they wanted to do. So I think this is why we have so careful. Are we talking about a conspiracy, a long-term plan by a secretive elite, or are we talking about a competing reason? I mean, just one last example. For example. It is well known that in parts, at least in some Mexican provinces, right, state institutions collaborate with the cartels. That is a conspiracy. That is a conspiracy, right? But we know that it's going on. So it's not secret, but I think it still qualifies as a conspiracy. Or Iran-Contra in a sense, right? So I think we have plenty of historical examples where actual conspiracies happened, but that doesn't make anything that we don't like, so to speak, a conspiracy. And this goes for the other side as well. And this is why I think COVID was a fantastic example for this. So people said something that was plausible, something that was potentially correct, but you added something to it. So, and this was the case in Germany, right? That then you could drag it into the realm of conspiracy, and you could say, and everybody who believes, even the 99% that are not BS, if you can excuse my French, then they can still kind of place you with those particular people. So I think a lot of this was trying to shut people up in a sense. So I think it's like you can end conversations with calling somebody a racist, and I think we have also a point where you can end a conversation with calling somebody a conspiracist.
Definitely.
Sorry, it was longer than expected.
I mean, I would just add one thing to that, which is that the reason I'm sympathetic to conspiracy theorists, even if they believe things that I think are in their kind of detail absurd at times, often the thrust of what they believe is right. And that's actually more important. So, this whole thing about the World Economic Forum, this is a hugely popular conspiracy theory. I don't put as much store as they do into the power of Klaus Schwab, the head of the World Economic Forum, to unilaterally direct world events. But the general thrust that the economy has been set up in a way by people with capital and with economic power to disadvantage them. And that has been true for a long time. And that those people with access to that power meet in closed talking shops, such as Davos, where they arrange the world to their own convenience, is true. Yeah. So frankly, whether they go an extra 10% or 20%, I think I feel forgiving of. And the same is true in a lot of examples. Technology, we have conspiracy theorists about social media. the tech companies did collude with the government. They do all the time. They do censor you. They do shadow ban you. They do police political correctness. All of those things are true. So those of us who live in the world of social media, of course you get slightly conspiratorial because you realize there really are powers that you have no control over, that are outside the room, that are deciding what you can say and what you can't say. So, you know, perhaps we should be more forgiving.
Yeah, just to defend them even further. I mean, maybe we don't need to here, but in a kind of secular world, if you're living kind of post-religion, then what stories do you tell yourself about the way you live or the way the world works? This is Mary Harrington wrote a piece today in UnHerd about the idea of allegory. What stories do we tell ourselves about how the universe functions if we are setting aside kind of religious narratives? And I think for lots of people, especially people who are bend towards the romantic or emotional, there is this urge towards, I have an instinctive feeling about the way justice works, that there is injustice. And so they project these grand narratives, and sometimes, as you say, they become totally inflated and allegorical, but they come from a kind of seed of something that they know in their gut to be true, which I think used to be what people felt maybe about their relationship with God. And so that I think, especially for younger people, in our polling we found that it was incredibly young people who were the most conspiratorial. So there is going to be a generation of people who are highly conspiratorial coming up now, becoming adults. I think that might be because we've grown up without religion.
Can I just throw one
Does anyone else want to come in? Sorry, and then we'll come back to you. Okay, we've got Rupert over here.
Thank you. I think there's a very important distinction between, on the one hand, a kind of healthy appreciation of complexity and nuance which characterises the world that we live in, and on the one hand, and then the kind of allure of simplicity on the other hand. And so the kind of conspiracy that I think we're all rightly, the kind of conspiracy theories that we're all rightly kind of applauding are those that question received events and kind of official interpretations of the world, because those have repeatedly been proved to be false, and so healthy skepticism is very, very healthy, a very, very important part of democracy. As long as you maintain it in the frame of complexity and nuance, and you may never quite know the exact truth, but you're going to try and seek it out. As opposed to, and Freddie, I thought you wrote a really interesting piece based on your polling data on this earlier this week, the simplicity that the true conspiracy theory creates, which is that all the ills of my life can be explained by this theory. And that is, that fits in with more of the kind of secretive cabal version of conspiracy theory. And you wrote a very interesting piece, which is to parallel groups who are receptive to that kind of idea are also very, very receptive to cynical populist narratives from politicians, because what all those narratives have in common is simplicity, i.e. all of your problems can be put down to the rich conspiring against you, or all of your problems can be put down to immigration and immigrants. These are different versions of simplistic and simple populist narratives. And so I think that, that if you're trying to differentiate between conspiracy theories that we should investigate and champion, it is this kind of, I think, this differentiation between that kind of appreciation of complexity and the kind of dangerous lure of simplicity on the other hand.
Have they, I just got to push back 1 second here, Rupert. Yeah. Have they not been driven to that point by too many generations of politicians who said, we understand all of the nuances and complexities, you don't need to trouble yourselves, we'll handle things well. And they haven't. And so they now hear someone sounding patronising from the quote-unquote elite, saying, oh, it's frightfully complicated in ways that you needn't bother yourself with, and they say, screw you, I'm going to go with my instinct on
this. No judgment on that, but it is an observational fact that, dangerous populist narratives, there are some populist narratives that aren't dangerous, I'm sure you appreciate that, but the more dangerous ones do tend to be simplifying and simplistic. And I think that those are dangerously attractive to some people. And we've seen tragically in European history over the last 100 years that they can become very dangerously so. So I think that there is a different...
Second World War, we got it. Well, we're there.
Well, can I suggest that simplicity is a symptom of the other end of the spectrum as well? That if you, especially some of the language we saw over the past couple of years, follow the science, go and get your vaccine for a donut, just trust authority, and the idea that, that there's something faulty about you if you're not just blindly trusting authority. That's terribly simplistic. The idea that we should be just listening to, that there is a homogenous science and Fauci and the government and the BBC, and if you question them, you're a dangerous conspiracy theorist who should probably be shut up and banned from the internet. That kind of view has emerged, and it's horribly simplistic, and it suggests that there's no nuance in that really. And I do think that at a time when many of these institutions that need to earn their trust failed really badly in recent years on a number of different things, and now punishing people for not trusting them and stigmatizing them with this kind of language. That is not a healthy position to take, to just unconditionally kind of intellectually submit yourself to people that have authority and say, I will believe and do whatever I am told. That's the kind of death of a democracy.
I just want to add one little thing to that, and then I'm going to ask Ralph to come in, which is that I found the last few years quite radicalizing, because some of the most dangerous ideas have come from the most sophisticated people. The more educated you are, in particular the so-called rationalists, who pride themselves on their ultra-rational view of the world, they often lead society and their way of thinking into a very dark place, and cannot see past their PhDs. And actually the intuitions of less educated sometimes people, or people who are less interested in the nuance, first of all end up correct, provably in the real world, but also take account of intuition and take account of a rounded human being in ways that they are unable to do. So I've veered much more towards the intuition team than the ultra-rationalist team. Ralph, where do you stand on this?
And I think that particularly because it kind of ventures through a little bit, which I think is a very important conversation about, kind of the difference between elites and non-elites. But I think there's one thing since we talked a lot about polls today, that we have to keep in mind. We did a couple of polls, and we looked at this in Austria and Germany, and we also looked at it in the US, kind of what is the best predictor if somebody is going to vote for a populist, right? If somebody is voting for, let's say, a fringe party, if you want. And it turned out that the best predictor to find out is if that person was saying yes on a questionnaire, that they have no voice. Right, that they are ignored by the system, that they are ignored by politics. So I think a lot of approval, let's say, of conspiracies is not so much that people really necessarily believe all those conspiracies down to the core, but for them it's a way to show their disapproval to those who they feel no longer listen to them. And we have a growing number of people. It's true in Germany, it's true in Austria, and you gentlemen and ladies, you know this better than I do, but I think it's partially true in the United Kingdom as well. What has been happening psychologically, mentally, not so much financially, right? Because the welfare state kind of catches people in a material sense. But what has happened to the lower socioeconomic classes is in many ways a crime, to be quite honest. I mean, these people have been devoid of meaning, and now we're all surprised that they try to find that meaning somewhere else. You mentioned the PhD, but that's exactly the point, right? We are all the professor who sits here in his nice three-piece, and it's a chat setting between Vienna and London. So I live a fantastic life. So it's very easy for me then, to pontificate upon these things. But many people don't have access to these things, and very often we mock. Not we, I apologize for that, but very often they feel, let's put it this way, they feel mocked by the elites, right? They feel that they look down upon them. And I remember, you probably remember this better than I do, I think this was a couple of years ago when Gordon Brown was caught on a hot mic after he was talking to an elderly lady, and they said, oh, this was a nightmare, what a horrible, horrible human being, because she was telling him the things that for her and many other people in her conditions was really causing then disconcert and suffering. And instead of being understanding or trying to do something, it was, those rubes and their mundane problems. And so we create a growing number of people that will be interested in conspiracy theories, not again because they believe them, but they want to take revenge. They want to shut up those who they feel never listen to them. And this is going to be a problem in the years to come, from Austria to the United Kingdom.
We have only 2 minutes left, but we're going to take one very quick question. There's a lady here who has a question.
Hello, my name's Francis. I'm from Australia. My question is for Ralph. You were talking about how we have become more willing to hand power to the state. So I want to know, why do you think that we have become more willing to hand power to the state? And more troublingly, why some of the, I guess, especially during COVID, some of the enforcements that the government placed actually changed social norms in a way that, for example, I don't know, people became used to lockdowns or became used to masks, and they would shame other people or scapegoat people who didn't get vaccinated and things like that. Why do you think that those changes have taken place?
2 minutes.
Actually, 1 minute now. So.
No, but it's a great question. So my very quick answer, and I'm glad that we can talk in more detail afterwards. I think because we have, in a sense, and very often we have destroyed or undermined many of the intermediate institutions. Right? We have many more people, for better or worse, who directly depend on the state. Again, not just financially, in other areas as well. And this in some, now I sound like a conspiracist, right? But in many ways, of course, this was done on purpose, because many institutions were seen as an obstacle to liberty, were seen as an obstacle to individuality, to individualism, whether it's the family, whether it's church. So what is the best way to break people out of those supposedly constraining institutions? Well, you let the state jump in. Right? So children say, I want to do this, and maybe your parents disagree. So what's the best way to allow children to do what they want under the exclusion of their parents? Well, if the state supports you, your parents say you become a doctor, you say you want to become a political scientist, and then happened to my parents. Look where I ended. And then the state says, your parents don't really have a say. You can do whatever you want. And I think then you gradually create the conditions where people are more and more depending on the state. And then it's to be clear, I think this is very well intended, because it is the most powerful institution. But then you end up with these relations. And just as a last sentence is, we saw this already in 2008 during the financial crisis. This was, I find, such an interesting contrast to the US. In the US, you had the Tea Party movement that pretty much said, the government, get out of our lives, we can take care of ourselves. But I don't know how it was in London, but at least in continental Europe, everybody said, where's the state? The state needs to do more. We see it now in the energy crisis. It's the same thing. Right? The first thing people say, well, then the government has to pay my electric bill. Well, then government has to pay my heating. The problem is the government says, no problem, we're going to do it. But there is a famous quote by the economist Herb Stein who said, something that cannot go on forever won't. And at some point, right, it's just not going to. And then we are, as you said before, right, and then we run into the problem, if you make more and more promises, and all of a sudden you can no longer keep them, the population, I assume, will not react very, very fondly. So we are in a crisis in that sense.
We've run out of time. I just need to thank everyone for coming, finding a way on this cold evening to our little salon here and sharing your views and being part of this conversation. Thank you so much to Silkie Carlo and Ralph Schoellhammer, and of course our very own Florence Read, for leading our discussion today. Personally, I found it really interesting and actually important, because unless, even within this room, there are people who strongly disagree on these points, and if this place can be a little crucible that fosters some kind of atoms of understanding across those camps, we will have succeeded. So thank you, and thanks to the online audience. See you next time.